Picture this. You're the most powerful person in the known world. You have armies at your command, wealth beyond imagination, and the ability to decide who lives and who dies with a simple gesture. But in a moment of pure rage, you do something so terrible that it haunts you for the rest of your life. You kill the person you claim to love most with nothing more than a single, violent kick. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of Roman Emperor Nero and how he murdered his pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina, in a fit of uncontrolled fury. And trust me, the details of this story are far more twisted and disturbing than anything Hollywood could dream up. Most people know Nero as the emperor who supposedly fiddled while Rome burned, though that's actually a myth. But what really happened in his private chambers on that fateful day in 65 AD was very real, very brutal, and changed the course of Roman history forever. Before we dive into that horrific moment, you need to understand who these people really were, because this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was the explosive end to one of the most toxic, manipulative relationships in ancient history. Let's start with Nero himself. By the time our story takes place, he'd already been emperor for over a decade. He came to power at just 16 years old after his mother Agrippina orchestrated the poisoning of Emperor Claudius. Yeah, that's the kind of family we're dealing with here. Nero didn't just inherit the throne. It was practically handed to him on a silver platter soaked in blood. But here's where it gets interesting. Nero wasn't supposed to be a monster. His early advisors, particularly the philosopher Seneca, actually tried to mold him into a decent ruler. For the first few years of his reign, things weren't terrible. He reduced taxes, gave more power to the Senate, and even banned gladiatorial games where blood was shed. Sounds reasonable, right? The problem was, absolute power and a weak character are a dangerous combination. As Nero grew older and more confident in his position, his true nature began to emerge. He became obsessed with performing, singing, acting, racing chariots. He wanted to be loved not as an emperor, but as an artist. The Roman elite found this embarrassing and undignified, but that was nothing compared to what was coming. Now let's talk about Poppaea Sabina. This woman was absolutely stunning. Ancient sources consistently describe her as one of the most beautiful women of her time. But she wasn't just a pretty face. Poppaea was intelligent, ambitious, and ruthlessly calculating. She knew exactly how to use her beauty and charm to get what she wanted. When we first encounter Poppaea in the historical record, she's married to Rufius Crispinus, a Roman knight. But she quickly realized that wasn't going to get her the power and status she craved. So she set her sights higher, much higher. Her first major move was seducing Marcus Salvius Otho, who would later become emperor himself. Otho was young, wealthy, and well-connected, perfect for Poppaea's plans. She divorced her first husband and married Otho, gaining access to the highest circles of Roman society. But even that wasn't enough for her, because through Otho, she met Nero. The attraction was immediate and intense. Nero was completely captivated by her beauty, but more than that, he was fascinated by her intelligence and ambition. Here was a woman who wasn't intimidated by his power. She wanted to share it. There was just one problem. Nero was already married to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor Claudius. This marriage had been arranged for political reasons when they were both children, and by all accounts, it was loveless. Octavia was reportedly virtuous and dutiful, but she lacked the fire and passion that Nero craved. Poppaea saw her opportunity, and she took it. She began an affair with Nero while still married to Otho. But she was smart about it. She didn't just throw herself at the emperor. Instead, she played hard to get, which only made Nero want her more. The situation became so tense that Nero eventually sent Otho away to govern the province of Lusitania, basically modern-day Portugal. It was a prestigious appointment on paper, but everyone knew it was really exile. Nero wanted Otho as far away from Rome and Poppaea as possible. With her husband out of the picture, Poppaea had Nero all to herself. But she wanted more than just to be his mistress. She wanted to be his wife, his empress. She wanted official recognition and power. This is where things get really dark, because Poppaea didn't just want to marry Nero, She wanted to completely replace Octavia in every way, and she was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen, no matter how many people had to suffer or die in the process. The stage was now set for one of the most twisted love triangles in history, one that would end in multiple murders, including the brutal death of Poppaea herself. But how did we get from passionate love affair to deadly violence? That's what we're about to explore. To understand how Nero could kill the woman he supposedly loved, you have to understand just how completely toxic their relationship had become. This wasn't a normal marriage. This was two deeply disturbed people feeding off each other's worst impulses. Poppaea's influence on Nero was immediate and devastating. She didn't just want to be empress. She wanted to reshape the entire empire according to her whims. And she had the perfect tool to do it: Nero's obsessive love for her. The first victim of their relationship was Nero's mother, Agrippina. Now, Agrippina was no innocent. She'd murdered her way to power and controlled Nero's early reign with an iron fist. But she also recognized that Poppaea was dangerous. Agrippina could see that this woman would stop at nothing to get what she wanted, and she tried to warn her son. Big mistake. Poppaea convinced Nero that his mother was plotting against him, that she was trying to control him like a child. She whispered poison in his ear night after night until Nero became convinced that the woman who'd put him on the throne was now his greatest enemy. In 59 AD, Nero arranged for his mother's assassination. The first attempt was almost comically elaborate. He had a specially designed boat built that would collapse and drown her during what was supposed to be a pleasant cruise. But Agrippina was tougher than they expected. She survived the accident and swam to shore. Realizing that subtlety wasn't working, Nero sent soldiers to finish the job. According to the historian Tacitus, Agrippina's last words were telling the soldiers to stab her in the womb, the same womb that had carried the monster who was now having her killed. With Agrippina dead, there was nothing standing between Poppaea and her goal of becoming empress. But first, they had to deal with Octavia. Poor Octavia never stood a chance. She was everything that Roman society valued in a woman: modest, dutiful, loyal. But those weren't the qualities that excited Nero. He wanted passion, drama, intensity. He wanted Poppaea. The divorce wasn't simple, though. Octavia was popular with the Roman people, and she was the daughter of a previous emperor. Divorcing her for no good reason would cause a scandal that could threaten Nero's rule. So Poppaea helped manufacture reasons. They accused Octavia of adultery, of plotting against the emperor, of being barren. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter when you controlled the narrative. In 62 AD, Nero finally divorced Octavia and married Poppaea. The wedding was lavish beyond anything Rome had ever seen. Poppaea wore a crown of pearls and gold, and Nero declared that she was the most beautiful woman who had ever lived. For a brief moment, it seemed like they might actually be happy together. Poppaea had achieved her ultimate goal. She was now Empress of Rome, and Nero was completely devoted to her, showering her with gifts and attention. But power and paranoia go hand in hand, and it didn't take long for cracks to appear in their relationship. Poppaea, now that she had what she wanted, became increasingly demanding and cruel. She had Octavia executed on trumped-up charges, even though the former empress was living in quiet exile. She couldn't stand the thought that there might be someone out there who had a better claim to Nero's affections. Meanwhile, Nero was becoming more erratic and unpredictable. His performances were becoming more frequent and more bizarre. He was spending enormous amounts of money on his artistic pursuits while the empire's finances crumbled. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, which destroyed much of the city, gave him an excuse to build an enormous palace complex called the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. The Roman elite were growing increasingly restless. There were whispers of conspiracy, talk of replacing Nero with someone more stable. And Poppaea, who had once been so confident in her ability to control her husband, was starting to realize that she might have created a monster she couldn't contain. Their fights became legendary throughout the palace. Servants would whisper about the screaming matches that could be heard through the walls. Nero's temper, always volatile, was becoming completely unpredictable. And Poppaea, pregnant with their second child, was finding it harder to manage his moods. The final straw came in 65 AD, during what should have been a minor domestic argument. The details vary depending on which ancient source you read, but the basic facts are consistent and horrifying. Nero had been out late, probably at the races or performing somewhere. When he came home, Poppaea confronted him. Maybe she was upset about his spending, or his performances, or another woman. Ancient sources suggest she was particularly angry about his plan to perform in a major public festival, which she saw as beneath the dignity of an emperor. The argument escalated quickly, and then, in a moment of pure rage, Nero did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The moment that would define Nero's legacy forever happened in an instant. According to the Roman historians, Tacitus and Suetonius, during their heated argument, Nero became so enraged that he kicked Poppaea violently in the stomach. She was heavily pregnant at the time, and the force of the blow was devastating. Poppaea collapsed immediately. Ancient sources describe her screaming in agony as blood began to flow. The kick had caused massive internal injuries, and both she and her unborn child were dying. What makes this moment even more horrific is what happened next. Instead of calling for help or showing any remorse, Nero initially just stood there, watching his wife and child die from his own violent action. Some sources suggest he was so shocked by what he'd done that he was temporarily paralyzed by the enormity of it. When physicians finally arrived, there was nothing they could do. Poppaea died within hours, along with their unborn child. The woman who had manipulated her way to the top of the Roman world, who had orchestrated murders and destroyed lives to achieve her ambitions, died on the floor of her own palace at the hands of the man she'd worked so hard to control. But here's where the story gets even stranger. Nero's reaction to what he'd done reveals just how twisted his mind had become. Instead of admitting his crime or showing genuine remorse, Nero went into complete denial. He declared that Poppaea had died of a sudden illness. He ordered the most elaborate funeral Rome had ever seen, spending vast sums of money on exotic spices and perfumes to burn with her body. He even had a statue of her erected and declared that she had become a goddess. Most disturbingly, Nero began to search obsessively for women who resembled Poppaea. He found a slave boy named Sporus who looked remarkably like her, and actually had him castrated and dressed as a woman so he could marry him in a grotesque ceremony. This wasn't just grief. This was complete psychological breakdown. The murder of Poppaea marked the beginning of the end for Nero's reign. The Roman elite, already disgusted by his behavior, were horrified by what had happened. Even those who had disliked Poppaea recognized that an emperor who could kill his pregnant wife in a fit of rage was too dangerous to remain in power. Conspiracies began forming almost immediately. The most serious was the Pisonian conspiracy of 65 AD, named after Gaius Calpurnius Piso, who was supposed to replace Nero as emperor. The plot involved dozens of senators, knights, and even some of Nero's own guards. When the conspiracy was discovered, Nero's response was typically brutal and paranoid. He ordered the deaths of anyone even remotely connected to the plot. His old tutor Seneca was forced to commit suicide. Lucan, one of Rome's greatest poets, was also killed. The bloodbath was enormous, and it only convinced more people that Nero had to go. The emperor's grip on reality continued to deteriorate. He became convinced that everyone around him was plotting his death. He saw enemies everywhere and trusted no one. His performances became more frequent and more bizarre, as if he was trying to escape into fantasy rather than deal with the reality of what he'd become. In 68 AD, just 3 years after Poppaea's death, the end finally came. Military commanders in Gaul and Spain declared their independence from Rome. The Praetorian Guard, who were supposed to protect the emperor, turned against him. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Realizing that his time was up, Nero fled Rome with a few loyal servants. As enemy soldiers closed in on his hideout, he prepared to take his own life rather than face capture. According to Suetonius, his last words were, "What an artist dies in me." Even at the end, he was more concerned about his lost artistic career than the lives he'd destroyed. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, his secretary Epaphroditus helped him drive a dagger into his throat as the soldiers broke down the door. The irony is almost too perfect. The man who had killed so many others, including his own wife, and unborn child, couldn't find the courage to end his own life when the time came. Nero's death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled Rome since Augustus. The empire plunged into civil war as different factions fought for control. The year 69 AD became known as the Year of the Four Emperors, as the imperial throne changed hands multiple times. But perhaps the most lasting impact of that single, violent kick was what it revealed about absolute power and human nature. Nero had everything: wealth, power, adoration. But none of it could fill the emptiness inside him or control his violent impulses. The woman who had schemed and manipulated her way to the throne, and the emperor who let passion and rage rule his decisions, both paid the ultimate price. In trying to possess each other completely, they destroyed everything they'd worked to build. Their story remains one of history's most chilling examples of how love can become obsession, and how power without restraint leads inevitably to destruction.